During the last half of the 20th century, academia around the world started to recognize the fact that historical and social factors have been rather inauspicious to the representation of women in the various disciplines of music, which includes an overwhelming void in the college textbooks used to prepare music educators. In a time when the oppression of minorities has come to the forefront of our societal consciousness, this short presentation intends to inspire students in hopes of starting a conversation that can lead to a more inclusive perspective when we study the history of music. The Middle Ages were also called the Dark Ages, but they were especially dark for female thinkers, many of whom were persecuted by the church and burned at the stake as witches for venturing into the world of science, intellectualism, and the creative arts. After the medieval period, which spanned about 1,000 years, came the age of rebirth known as the Renaissance. This period was characterized by the advent of humanism, an era of enlightenment in which human thought became validated. One of the main reasons for the innovating intellectual advances of the Renaissance was the invention of the printing press, which revolutionized the way people communicated. Composers also started to mass print their music, which allowed for wider distribution. Not surprisingly, women did not have the same access to resources for publishing their own music as their male counterparts, most of whom were hired by the church. Thus, their publications always required to have the sponsorship of a male patron. In the case of Renaissance composer Vittoria Aleotti, that man was her father, a prominent architect from Ferrara, Italy. Vittoria was an avid musician, singer, and composer who lived as a nun in a convent in northern Italy. She was the first woman to have a book of sacred music published under her name. This audio clip is a motet from her book Sacre Canciones, and it's called Together with the Angel. Renaissance music was marked by the development of polyphony, which advanced the concept of the cantus firmus, the religious chants preserved in manuscripts by Gregorian monks during the late Middle Ages. Such advancements included the interaction of several voices, all of which were independent from each other and produced a rich musical texture. Of the different forms of polyphonic music in this era, madrigals were the most prominent. They were usually written for several voices, unaccompanied and through composed, no stanzas or repetitions. Composers aimed at highlighting the emotions of the text through musical contrivances. Maddalena Casulana was the first ever female composer to have a whole book of secular music printed and published in the history of Western music. She financed this venture herself with the wealth of her late husband. This polyphonic madrigal by Casulana is called My Heart Cannot Die. Following the Renaissance, the Baroque era spanned about a century and a half. Many of the features of modern music, such as tonality and form, started to develop during this period. The use of frills and trills, fioriture, appoggiaturas, and grace notes. Fast notes flurrying up and down were all characteristic of this era. In this manuscript from the Baroque period, an explanation is given for all the exuberant ornamentation devices that were commonly used in this period. Homophony also started to become popular in the Baroque. Literally meaning same sound, the term homophony refers to a group of accompanying musicians, all of whom play harmony and more or less the same rhythm. These ensembles served as background to a soloist playing the main melody, usually in a treble instrument, as is the flautist in this painting. Instrumental music in the Baroque era started to become more prominent than vocal music, and the orchestra began to take shape. In this period, the traditional orchestra was constituted primarily by strings with a few primitive wind instruments. After the popular modes of the Renaissance, tonality began to settle in the Baroque onto the 12 major keys we know today and their relative minors. On this instrument, called the harpsichord, Bach composed his book The Well-Tempered Clavier, that features one prelude and one fugue in each of those 24 tonalities. The sonata form was developed extensively in the Baroque period and slowly morphed into the concerto form, which is basically a sonata for solo instrument and orchestra. This is Sonata number 12 for violin, orchestra, and continuo by composer Isabella Leonarda. The suite was another popular form of composition in the Baroque and consisted of a series of short dances or movements such as minuet, gavotte, bourrée, allemande, and others. This is a minuet from the Suite in D minor for harpsichord by composer Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. As we move forward in history, innovations in music started to happen at a faster pace. The classical period only lasted about 75 years, but it is the one which had the most influence in the music of the subsequent eras. In the classical style, homophony was further developed to create clean, elegant lines in which the melody can be clearly distinguished from the chordal accompaniment. This melody featured shorter, more defined phrases than that of the Baroque period, usually lasting 4 measures in length. Phrases with varying melodies and rhythms were then combined to form themes. During the classical era, the concerto form slowly gave way to the modern symphony, where the main melody is passed around amongst the major sections of the orchestra as opposed to being played by a solo instrument. This example by Mariana Martinez, her Symphony No. 1 in C major performed on period instruments, masterfully blends all the sections and gives each one a meaningful and melodious part. The orchestra as we know it today began to take its definite shape during the classical period. By this time, the instruments in the string section had reached their definite shape and variety. The woodwind quintet was added as well as the trumpet and timpani, and conductors played an instrument with the ensemble, usually the first violin. Here's a video clip example of such an orchestra performing on period instruments. Harmonically, music in the classical period typically dwelled around the tonic and dominant, occasionally modulating to a neighboring key, a fifth above or below, or to a relative minor. This harmonic environment was well defined by strong cadences. In the classical period, the piano ultimately substituted the harpsichord as an instrument of choice for most composers. Chamber music, including piano trios, string quartets, wind quintets, and other small ensembles, also became a popular form of composition in the classical period. This divertimento for piano and flute by Matilda de Orozco is called Axel's Monologue. The classical and romantic eras overlap for a couple of decades, as it also happens with all the other historic periods. Some composers, as they transition from one style to the next, are classified as both late classical and early romantic. The Romantic era was characterized by its expressiveness and drama. Emotions in the Romantic period were of utmost importance, and many compositions aimed to portray deep feelings of courage, sadness, love, or tragedy. Inspiration in the Romantic period most often came from non musical themes such as animals, nature, literature, and the visual arts. Programmatic music was also a characteristic of this period. This kind of composition attempts to portray a narrative, to tell a story through musical imagery, usually hinted towards in the title or literally described in program notes, hence the nomenclature. Romantic composers valued freedom more than anything and soon broke away from the stiff conventions of the classical era. In order to get the listener engaged, they juxtaposed contrasting tonalities, time signatures, and orchestral colors, and in a composition from this period, the expected cadences often led to an unexpected new harmonic plane. Orchestras grew in numbers and kinds of instruments, and some compositions like the Ode Triomphale by composer Augusta Holmes call for a 300-piece orchestra and a 900-piece choir. She composed it in 1889 for the centennial of the French Revolution. She also wrote 12 symphonic poems, 4 operas, and hundreds of other pieces, but her music is not as readily available in audio format as that of her male counterparts from that period. So, in lieu of that centennial piece, this is an excerpt of Irlande, an ode to her ancestral homeland. The period of Romantic music was also the age of musical flamboyance. While piano virtuosos from Poland and Hungary were making headlines in Europe, in Venezuela, a young girl was making history as a pianist, composer, and all around child prodigy. Her name was Teresa Carreño. By the age of 10, she was already an international performer, appearing in Latin America, the US, and Europe, including performances with the Berlin Philharmonic. This audio clip is a rare live performance of one of her pieces, played by the composer herself on a reproducing piano in 1905. These eight composers are just a few of the many thousands who deserve to be in the books of music history. Women have been writing music for at least 1,000 years, often in spite of dire societal obstacles, which their male counterparts seldom encounter. Yet, their accomplishments have been historically de emphasized. That must change. Therefore, as a follow-up activity, you will be using Adobe Spark to make a virtual timeline in which you will catalog 20 female composers by their time period. You may start with the ones you got to meet in this presentation. You will include an image of the composer, their name, and a short biography describing their works, style, and accomplishments, along with some samples of their music. You can also include images that represent their time period. In this way, you will expand your perspective of the history of composition to include the beautiful music created by women through the ages. By doing it online, you will be able to share it with the world and invite others to advocate with you for a more inclusive history of music.